for your introduction. And Assalamu alaikum to everyone. Thank you for coming here to hear me rant. It's a great honor to be here to discuss with you some very important topics. Before getting into the subject, I first want to say that I don't endorse the previous video, if you haven't already figured that out. It's wrong. So we're done, let's go. And the reason I don't endorse it actually has to do with prior research that I've done. I don't know if any of you have actually read any of my articles at the Institute. One of my very first articles there was regarding how the Muslim world declined scientifically. And this is actually part of my PhD thesis. So this was a subject that I've been very passionate about for quite some time. And when I was doing my undergrad in philosophy, we learned general philosophy, but then we have to pick a specialty before going to grad studies, right? So I picked the philosophy of science. And the reason I did is because one of my intellectual heroes was Thomas Kuhn. I don't know if you're familiar with Thomas Kuhn. Thomas Kuhn, oh, that's sad. Okay, well, Thomas Kuhn was University of Chicago professor who was basically he was a scientist, okay, but he decided he wanted to study the history of science. And he became a philosopher of science overnight, not overnight, but he took some time to develop this theory, which he elucidated in full in his book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which is probably one of the most influential books today on the philosophy of science. If you haven't read it, you need to read it if you want to understand science. Once again, it's called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn. He passed away, I believe, in 1996. And this was the only work he ever wrote. And he created such a massive impact in the world of philosophy and the world of science that people are still talking about that impact to this day and are trying to advance upon it. So, have you ever heard the word paradigm? It's a very common word. You came up with that word. So, some incentive to read Thomas Kuhn, okay? He developed that word purely for the sake of explicating his theory. All right. Paradigm shift was also his phrase. Paradigm shift. And he was trying to explain the nature of science. So he would say basically that, he would argue that basically science is made up of paradigms. And paradigms are basically, I like to call them tafsir, commentaries on the natural world. So we have, yes sir?
When was this written?
When was this written?
Yeah.
I don't remember the exact date it was written, so I apologize.
Okay.
However, it's now on its 4th edition, and they've added a lot of extra material post-death. Yeah, so these things that he was going to publish. Anyways, so basically a paradigm is like a commentary on the natural world, and what we do is that we look at the data around us, okay? And the data doesn't tell us what science is. We have to look at the data and try to figure out how to put it together in a coherent way. And so we develop from our own minds paradigms or commentaries to explain that data. So that's basically what science is. And then what happens is that eventually we get a lot of contradictory data, or we may get a lot of anomalous data, so the stuff that kind of contradicts the initial paradigm. So we start to modify that paradigm to the extent then we find out, well, this is becoming incoherent. So then we develop a new paradigm, completely new idea to try to explain how that data fits together. And that's exactly what happened when we transferred from the Ptolemaic system, the geocentric system, to the heliocentric system. So, it's just a little brief primer as to what the subject may be about. But anyways, today I want to discuss the Qur'an and science. And I want to tackle this recent, and I mean very, very, very recent argument for the validity of the Qur'an as a divine message. Like I said, very recent. You're going to find out how recent it is very soon. So I've titled this lecture a little bit controversially. So, a forced marriage. So, I want to catch your attention. Okay. And so, after doing all this research into history and sort of seeing how the Muslim world developed scientifically and declined scientifically, I came across some data that was an anomaly to this mainstream view today that the Qur'an has scientific miracles. I found a number of theories and interpretations from numerous scholars in the past that contradict this view. And I want to express that to you now, to show you what these people thought. So let's look into the subject. Yeah, awesome, bro. I'm very good at PowerPoint. So scientific miracles in the Qur'an. So first let's define what this is. So Mr. Kepanini, who is a scholar of Islamic studies, he was researching the Tafsir tradition, okay, and he came across scientific miracles in the Qur'an and numerous variations of sorry, am I facing the camera? Okay. Numerous variations of how this theory manifests itself. And he came to the conclusion that there are three main qualities behind this. Okay, the first one is the Quran contains mentions of scientific truths, neither known nor guessed at the time, in the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And the Quran contains nothing that conflicts with modern science. Its lack of anything that contradicts the most up-to-date science would have seemed astonishing in Muhammad's time, were it not that the Quran was a true revelation. And number three, the Quran contains a number of terms, the true meaning of which cannot be understood except in light of modern science. Okay? Would you say this is a pretty accurate description of the current sentiment towards the Quran and scientific miracles? All right. But there are a number of problems with this, and we're going to discuss them in more detail. The first problem is that it does not align with historical exegesis of the Quran, or historical interpretations of the Quran. What I mean is that the tradition of exegesis in Islamic history does not conform to this mainstream understanding. In fact, this is a very recent development since the 19th century. Now, there are some nuances. Like, for example, you do find some classical scholars trying to advance similar views, but not the same as what we have today. Not even close. We'll talk about that in a second. Number two, it does not align with historical scientific practice of Muslims. And this is an argument that I've actually come up with through my own research. We'll discuss that more later. And does not align with the objectives of the Quran itself. So let's discuss the first one, because I think that's going to be the primary argument we're going to use here. And by the way, I haven't really included that many slides because I really want to have more discussion and go on random rants. So you get bored with my slides after a while. Historical exegesis of the Quran. So what I want to look at first is one of the renowned figures in Islamic history, Imam Shafi'i, who was a 14th century scholar in Andalus. In his Muwafaqa, where he was explicating the fundamentals of Islamic law, the Sharia, okay, he mentioned some individuals, not by name, because he didn't see them as very important. He actually only dedicated 2 pages to this particular issue. But he noticed some individuals during his time were advancing the idea that there were scientific miracles in the Quran. So as far back as the 14th century, some people were actually entertaining the idea. But interestingly, he responds with the following, and I'm going to read this out because I just want to emphasize certain things. The fact that the Sharia is for the unlettered establishes that it must be in accordance with the practices of those who profess it, and these are the Arabs. So he's talking about the early Arabs, okay? He's not talking about during his time, all right? This leads to a number of fundamental assumptions. Among these issues is the assumption that many people cross the limits in defining the scope of the Quran, thus they attributed to it all kinds of sciences that the earlier and later thinkers had mentioned. Accordingly, they attributed to it the natural sciences, the exact rational sciences, logic, language, and all that has been the subject of examination of thinkers in these disciplines as well as others. If this approach is judged against what has preceded it, it does not appear to be valid. The worthy ancestors from among the companions, the followers, and those who came after them, God be pleased with them, were the people who knew the Quran and its disciplines the best. No report has reached us showing that any of them spoke about any of these things in such claims. Had they been occupied with the examination of such claims, reports would certainly have reached us to guide us on the basis of the issue. This did not happen. Therefore, it indicates that the issue did not exist for them. It amounts to an evidence that the Quran did not intend the establishing of any of the things that they conjectured. Essentially what he's arguing is that because the early Muslims never thought that there were any scientific miracles in the Qur'an, never derived any scientific information from the Qur'an, that this is an invalid method. Okay? And he's not the first to do this, to mention this. In fact, he's one of my examples. But interestingly enough, he notes that because the early Muslims were an unlettered people, and in this context he's mentioning them as unscientific, he's saying that the Qur'an would not be sent down to them in that manner because they would not understand it. He actually further expounds on this argument later on, and he even goes so far as to claim that it's basically haram to include that sort of information in the Qur'an because it infers that the early Muslims were not as knowledgeable as we are now with respect to the Qur'an, which is blasphemy, according to Imam Shafi'i. Okay, we're going to get into counter arguments regarding this claim, but for the meantime, I want you guys to sort of just take this in, and it serves as a jumping off point. Okay, so we're going to move in. Let's give you some examples. So, for example, this is a very famous ayah of the Quran that's used today to mention scientific miracles. Okay, so and after that, he spread the earth. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spread the earth out. Now, the word spread here has been interpreted in many ways as flat by a lot of Islamophobes and ex-Muslims, but it's also been interpreted by Zakir Naik as meaning the shape of an ostrich egg, or to shape like an ostrich egg, basically. Okay, I don't know if you've heard that argument. When he spread out the earth, he shaped it like an ostrich egg. Okay, but in fact, this is contrary to previous exegetes. For example, Ibn Kathir. Ibn Kathir, who also died in the 14th century, referencing Ibn Abbas, okay, who's considered probably the prime authority on tafsir, stated the following. This means that he brought out what was in it with a forceful action. So for him, the word spread out means to bring out with a forceful action. I'm going to keep reading this and then give you some imagery as to what this means, because there's more behind this. This is the meaning of what was said by Ibn Abbas and others, and it was the explanation preferred by Ibn Jarir. He spread out the earth, caused its springs to gush forth, brought forth its hidden benefits, caused its rivers to flow, etc., so that it could be a benefit to humanity. So what does he mean, though, by spreading out, to bring out in a forceful action? Does anybody know how Bedouin or Arabs traveling in the desert, what they do when they set camp? Has anybody ever been in the desert? Okay, so let me give you some image here. Okay, so imagine that you're going through the desert and it's kind of uneven, right? And the first thing you're going to do before you set your tent is what? Level the ground, right? Now, do these travelers usually carry around rugs or mats?
Probably.
Yes, they do, because they don't want to sit on a hot ground, right? And what do you do with the rug? Spread. You spread it out, but how?
Unroll it. Force.
Right? To force out so you can make it comfortable to sit. That's the imagery being employed here. Yet people will look at this verse and they say, oh no, it means the earth is flat. Oh no, it means that the earth is egg-shaped. Well, what's more beautiful? What's more consistent with how the Arabs themselves lived back then and what they would have understood from it? You see what I'm trying to say? Okay. So the early scholars didn't... Yes, ma'am?
But how do you know that this interpretation is also true?
How do we know that this interpretation is also true?
I mean, the interpretation of how...
Ibn Kathir?
Yeah, I mean...
Oh, well, it's more consistent with the with earlier scholars as well, and it's earlier, and it also involves the referencing of one of the companions and many others who transmitted this. So, I mean, we can go into the evidences for why certain interpretations are greater than others later on, but generally speaking, you know, in history, this is what we do. If you want to validate a particular interpretation of a text, especially a religious text, you always look for the earlier sources. You never look, like I would never interpret the Bible based on what 21st century scholar says about it. I would interpret the Bible based on somebody who collected the Bible, like, during that period of time. Now we're going to discuss, by the way, possible future interpretations based on the Qur'an being vague or open to multiple interpretations.
Yeah, because there's this ayah in Al-Imran which says that there's certain verses in the Quran which
They're
are
ambiguous.
and there's certain verses that are very, very clear and there's no argument about them.
And the earliest scholars would also collect numerous ones what they considered ambiguous, and neither of them were talking about natural phenomena. They usually had to do with like the letters, alif, lam, mim. Like those were the ones that were included as ambiguous. But when it came to like these, no. There was no reference to anything related to physical birth.
So you think our language now is like making a barrier for understanding such verses?
I think we're imposing certain meanings onto the Quran that are not there as a result of our cultural context and wanting to desperately prove to the world how advanced we are. But I'll get to that later. So let's get some.
Looking at like historical exegesis, like upstairs, who were like some of the first to promote an Quranic interpretation from a nazm, like structure and coherence? Because I would imagine you did that.
This is okay. So the early Tafsir basically had a very balanced approach.
Yeah.
Okay, so it became more specialized later on.
Yeah.
So for example, Imam Suyuti was primarily concerned with linguistics.
Yeah.
Okay, but prior to that, the classical exegesis included everything.
Yeah. From
hadith to they would even sometimes include science as supplementary, but they would never say that this is what it says absolutely.
Okay.
But the primary argument for the Qur'an's miraculous nature was primarily linguistic. Not linguistic, sorry, was primarily its coherency and its eloquence.
Yeah.
So
what was like the first? Because when hadith did asbab and nuzul, it was like one of the first, right?
Yeah, well that's probably like context based.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm asking like.
I am not familiar with who may have been the first.
Okay.
So I'm primarily studying where the scientific understanding of Quran came from. So, but I mean, I'll look into it. I believe that Ustadh Ali Khan has probably done the most research in this respect, with respect to who or where the arguments were derived and things like this. So, anyway, so we understand the difference here between certain classical exegetes and what we currently understand of these verses. Okay, so they had their approach towards understanding the Quran was that it had to be part of the early Muslim experience, because how would they have understood the Quran? How would it have impacted them if, this verse just said the earth was flat or the earth was round? What sort of impact does that have on an individual, morally, spiritually speaking? Allah is revealing to you, by the way, guys, the earth is round. Okay, I don't care. Honestly, like I'm starving. I can barely find food. I have these other tribes trying to kill me. Why would that have any sort of relevance to somebody living in the desert 1,400 years ago? Especially somebody who doesn't even understand the scientific enterprise, much less would do anything with it. Right? They didn't have access to the technology of the Byzantines or the Persians. They didn't need all this stuff. They're very simple people. So why would they care? That's something you should consider. So let's look at something else. Although some scholars entertain the idea that the Quran contains everything, including science, so for instance, Imam Ghazali mentioned that because the Quran says that it contains all forms of knowledge, he claimed that it contains it in a vague sense, in a general sense. In the same way that, the Quran mentions animals, but it doesn't mention every insect on planet Earth, or, every type of, different species. But it was never very specific. So it sort of referenced them, but it never got into the details. So the idea that the Quran contains scientific miracles only became mainstream around the 19th century. And this is interesting to note, because when you start to notice around after the 16th century that the Muslim world is declining significantly in science and technology. And what I mean by declining in science and technology is in ingenuity, not necessarily in adopting science and technology, because they were borrowing extensively from the Europeans. at that point in time. The Ottomans started to borrow a lot of military technology, etc. And even their astronomy was going down drastically. And they had to borrow a lot of concepts from European scientists. Okay, so they were still scientific, but they were no longer developing their own ideas or developing the fields themselves. Okay, so what's interesting about this is that the idea that the Quran contains scientific miracles started to come about really during the time of colonization, during a time when the Muslims felt degraded, felt like they were losing their power, felt like they needed to prove something to the people who were imposing power upon them, right? So they had an inferiority complex. So knowing that they had not discovered many of the new advanced scientific theories, knowing that they did not have a Copernicus, knowing that they did not discover plate tectonics, things like this, okay? Knowing all these advanced theories that we currently have today were not discovered by Muslims, and that's just a fact, unfortunately. They had to find a way to compensate. So let's go on. So why is this an issue? And this, we get into sort of theological issues here. But to assume that the early Muslims and classical scholars were unaware of these scientific interpretations implies that contemporary Muslims are more knowledgeable. Okay, that is an implication. We'll discuss further in a minute. To assume that the Quran reveals different meanings of the text to different generations implies that the Quran is subjective, relative, and its correct interpretations are entirely dependent on external factors, i.e. science, meaning it can't be for all time because there is no one eternal message. This might be a little complex to you guys, so let me give you a breakdown. If you say that the Quran has multiple meanings to the extent where every generation can read it differently, it pertains to my relevant context, okay? That means the Quran does not have a set message, okay? And what does that mean if it doesn't have a set message, one that can be ascertained objectively? That means it's not eternal. You're probably wondering, well, how can it not be eternal? Because everyone is interpreting it differently every time. It's still the Quran. No, it isn't. Because of the Quran's meaning continuously changes, even to mutually exclusive interpretations. Then what is it? It's a postmodern argument. I don't know if you're familiar with postmodernism, that everything is relative, nothing is objective, nothing is true. Right? It turns the Quran into basically whatever you want it to be, depending on what society or culture you're in at the time, whatever you need it for. It becomes a tool in that respect. And then it's judged based on the subjective interpretations rather than having its own meanings, which should be set in stone eternally, regardless of the multiple understandings that there are. And it says basically that you can measure the Quran's authenticity, its validity, based on that subjective experience. Yes, ma'am.
But I think the Quran part of being miraculous is that maybe during the Arabs they were very strong at Arabic, so this was the miracle in the Quran at that time. And the verses that talked about the signs were not, they took it as like they just had a understanding that like God's trying to describe something about how He created the universe and things, but they didn't know much details.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the end of the day, this is not the kind of details you would need to build, like, the basic iman you need to be a Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
But for example, in Surah Al-Qiyamah, God talks about the fingerprints and how He was able to do it, and now we know why the fingerprints are very special for every person,
Mm-hmm.
and this is new knowledge. And you can read this and not have the knowledge and still be impressed that yes, God created every part of me in a very good manner.
Okay.
But
So how do you suspect that we don't know the difference in fingerprints? Because if I look close enough and I look close enough at your thumb, I can see the difference. I don't need a microscope. Has anybody ever looked at your thumb? If you look close enough, you can see that the lines are a little bit different than your friends. What about the salt and the fresh water mixing? Is that difficult to find out? Or can you just sail there? What about embryology? The 3 stages. Can you view that? Because Galen did. several hundred years prior to the Muslims. What about the mountains as pegs? Is that plate tectonics? I don't think so. Even if we try to simplify it as much as possible, I don't think you can take. You can infer from that that was describing any form of plate tectonics in any shape or form. And to answer your question further, if that was the case, say if the Muslims were receiving a more simplistic understanding, whereas we're understanding of those simplistic terms or simplistic ayahs is now more complex, right? More accurate.
I'm saying that they had the power of the language, because we are not good, even the Arabs are not good in Arabic as they were, right? So they had the power of the language, and this is why they can understand the miracle of the Quran from the angle of the language of the Quran.
Okay.
But since we're bad we're not as good as them in the Arabic, so we can look at the Quran from the angle that we understand now better, I think science is now the hot topic of everything. So and we're kind of built in a way now that everyone wants to think with logic, with science and everything.
Yeah.
So even the Quran talks to people in this language by not, it's at the end of the day it's not a scientific book, but it gives you hints here and there that the one who has written these hints about the universe must be the creator, cannot be someone else.
Okay. So the Quran changes itself based on the needs of
No, it
the
doesn't
particular
change.
state.
You can just look at the Quran with different angles.
Different angles. Okay. So let's say that ISIS is reading the Quran. Is that a different angle? I'm just wondering.
No, that's not.
Why not?
Because they're living in our same age. And yeah.
But when they read this in the Quran, they say that certain ayahs have been abrogated to a certain extent. And they say that they can kill every single kuffar they come across. Every single kafir. And that every single Muslim is an apostate. And they deserve to die. And they say the Quran says it. Is that an angle? Or is that a misinterpretation?
Well, there's a huge difference between misinterpretation and interpreting something in the wrong way. That's quite clear that this is not the way to interpret.
I'm glad you brought up the difference. So let me ask you a question then. How do we determine what is a misinterpretation and what is a different angle? On the basis of the erroneous views of the population or the basis of the scholars of the past? Sorry, we're going to continue with the question and answers. Yeah.
Did you want to continue, Shay?
Yeah, I do want to kind of get done. So I'm sorry.
Can we do questions and answers at the end?
Yes, please. Yeah, no problem. Because I lose my train of thought. I lose my train of thought even when you're not talking, so it's a problem.
Okay,
I'm
sorry.
No, it's okay. No, it's not your fault. And I wasn't trying to be too challenged. I wanted you to see if you could tell me how to make that the justification behind which is a misinterpretation and which is just a different angle. Anyways, continuing. Assume that the Quranic ayat reveals science, assumes the science is static and unchanging, that the interpretations we have now won't be superseded by future data. So what this means is basically that we read the Quran and it says, oh, Big Bang. But then what happens if that paradigm is overturned? Uh-oh. That means the Quran was telling us the truth about an obsolete theory in the past? That's problematic because science is constantly changing, especially when we receive new data. Or even if the general idea is there, the Big Bang, the details will change drastically. Maybe the Big Bang is actually not the way that we think it is now. Maybe it's something else. And then somebody will find another reason to object to the Quran. Okay? And then we have to change our interpretation again. This becomes problematic. So, the Golden Age and scientific miracles. Now, here's where we get into my specific arguments regarding why I think that this is a problematic approach. And I don't know if you heard Zakir Naik saying this in the video, but he said that the reason that they made all these discoveries in astronomy and stuff is because they read the Quran. Okay? That's nonsense.
He said this?
Yes. If the Quran reveals objective scientific information, why did Allah not allow the early Muslim scientists to discover the Big Bang, heliocentrism, plate tectonics, or the nature of embryology? Why were these all discovered by European scientists? Why did they beat us to it if the Quran already had all that information in there? We were the most advanced civilization for nearly 1,400 years. What happened? It's in the Quran. Why didn't we figure it out? All right, were all the scholars stupid? Astaghfirullah. All these kuffar, they came up with it before, they didn't even read the Qur'an. How'd they come up with it? But we didn't. Amazing. Note the sarcasm. Amazing that Allah would allow His greatest ummah to be ignorant of the very things He put in there. And allow the non-believers, who apparently, aren't supposed to figure this stuff out, to come to it first. Amazing. Not only that, but if the Quran reveals objective scientific information, why did the early Muslim scientists never use the Quran to advance science? Because they didn't. For example, when the Muslims first began conquering the Byzantium and the Persian empires, the first thing that they did was they took all their books, all the ones that they wanted, and they translated them. They translated Aristotle, Galen, Plato. Why? It's in the Quran. Why do you need to translate all these works? For what reason would you need to translate the works of Greek scholars to figure out certain things about science? That makes no sense. Why wouldn't Allah reveal it to them instead? You don't need all these people. The Golden Age actually, now that's not to say that the Quran is not influential in many respects, or that it didn't tell the Muslims to go out and research things to empirically verify the world around them, but to suggest that there was scientific information therein, and for not one Muslim scholar to advance a scientific theory on the basis of the Quran. Rather, only to assume that the ayah were already talking about things that were already revealed. For example, the Ptolemaic system. Oh, we see the Quran is talking about Ptolemy's views of reality, physics. That's very curious. Some questions that need to be raised. And also some curious inconsistencies with people who often adopt this approach. Why do those who promote scientific miracles in the Quran not remain consistent in their interpretation? Example, why is it that they assume the ayat that discuss the sun and moon rising and setting are relative to the observer, but those passages which discuss other subjects aren't? So when it says the Quran, or when it says the sun sets, we often say what? Oh, that's not talking about geocentrism. That's just saying, oh, it's from our perspective, right? It's relative to us on Earth. But then when it comes to other passages, like saying that the mountains are firmly fixed or like pegs, you have certain individuals assuming, or quoting from obscure scientific journals and passages, suggesting that, oh, there's roots in the ground. And I've heard this argument. So it must be, that's literal. That's literal. But the other stuff, no, that's not literal. That's relative. How did the early Muslims not know about the Big Bang if the passage in question suggests that they should have known? So, for example, have those who disbelieve not considered that the heavens and the earth were a joined entity? That question infers that they already knew. Have those who disbelieve not considered that the heavens and the earth were a joint entity? Have not considered. Have you not thought about it already? It's rhetorical. He's not saying that, oh, I'm telling you that this has happened. I'm telling you, why aren't you thinking about something that you already know about? So they already had an understanding that the universe was combined at one point. Okay. So if they didn't know about this, if this was a scientific miracle in the Quran, then why is Allah talking to them as though they already have an awareness of what it is? Does that make sense? So it's not teaching them anything. They're already aware of these facts, according to their understanding of what they understand the physical world to be. And we're going to discuss this more, hopefully in the Q&A, but the nature of language and the nature of how you express a message through someone's understanding. Maybe I'll give you an example right now. It's not a perfect analogy, but imagine that I'm going into a classroom of kids. Third graders, fourth graders, whatever. And they believe in Santa Claus, okay? I know Santa Claus doesn't exist, but they don't. Are you okay?
I'm
Sorry,
sorry,
I
I
didn't
heard
mean
me a
to
little
break that to
bit
you right
but
now. I'm
it's okay.
sorry.
It's all right. I'll
I'll
cry
have to
later.
call your parents. So imagine that I'm going into this classroom and I want to teach them about generosity. Okay? Now, I can go in there and go, hey guys, Santa doesn't exist, I'm sorry. But let's talk about generosity. That wouldn't be very helpful. Right? Now, if I said to them, I want to teach you guys about generosity. Who believes in Santa Claus? All the kids raise their hands, they're all happy and stuff, right? And then I start talking to them, I'm like, okay, so Santa would do this, Santa would do that, you know? And they're like, yeah, and then they learn the lesson, okay? Whether Santa exists or not is irrelevant to that message, correct? It doesn't make my message incorrect because I mentioned Santa Claus. I'm just trying to appeal to the individual's perception. In the same way, when the Qur'an mentions, like, when you see the sun and the moon chasing each other, things like this, it's trying to express a message other than the physical reality that's being mentioned there. And we're going to get into that later as well, the objective of the Qur'an. Because the Qur'an in numerous places mentions physical reality only for one purpose. To ask man if he feels grateful. To tell man that he should be grateful. It has what we call a teleological theme. Teleology means the purpose. Okay? The purpose for these objects is to be for this. That is what the Qur'an is often relating, or most of the time, or all the time relating, with regard to physical phenomena. Even when it talks about embryology, the three phases, or the three darknesses in the mother's womb, it's trying to express what? Allah's mercy, His graciousness towards you. Like, this is what you became. When I created you you were nothing. And yet now look what you are. Everything here. He's trying to give you an image. He's trying to give you a realization. Right? He's not trying to express, like I said, why would the Arabs care about quantum physics? Or even understand that? Or something even related to something out there? Why would they even care about anything that does not have any sort of relevance to their everyday lives? Something to question. So what is the Qur'an's objective? After this, we're going to get into the actual discussion. To give spiritual and moral guidance to humanity, to remind them of proper belief in Allah and the true tenets of His religion, Islam. Once again, the Qur'an says that it's a reminder. It's a reminder. It's a form of guidance. It's also a Furqan. It's demarcating between false belief and true belief. Okay? But it often tells its reader, or its listener, that it's reminding them of something. How can you teach scientific facts to people you're reminding? They already know. They already know their experiences. They know what they're seeing. You don't need to tell them anything new. And what is the best way to teach a moral or spiritual lesson? Is it to teach them new information that they have to, try to grasp with all their intellect? Or is it just refer to things that they already have awareness of? Do you not see? Do you not listen? Many times the Qur'an is rhetorical. It's asking them to reflect over things that they already see on a daily basis. It's not telling them, oh, by the way, the Earth's plates move in this direction. Like they would care. Not only that, but even if they wouldn't care, let's think about, let me give you this little possibility. Imagine that the Qur'an did come down with scientific information. Present scientific information. Let's imagine that, okay? Let's imagine that it expressed quantum physics. Now, today we'd be like, this is amazing. This is a miracle, right? Back then, they'd probably be like, this is nonsense. Think about it. You think that they would have adopted the Qur'an as a miraculous message if they thought that the information therein was nonsensical to them? Because to them, Big Bangs, quantum physics, plate tectonics, that's probably all nonsense. Saying that the Earth below us moves like an ocean, they'd probably be like, what are you talking about? They'd be like, this guy is nuts. That's exactly what the Quraysh did in many respects, but they said it from a different perspective. They said he was possessed, or he was, he had magic or sorcery. But they never mentioned, oh, his physical accounts of the universe are wrong. right? That was never an angle. I wonder why. Because it's the purpose of the Quran to send down scientific information. If it is, then why did the early Arabs not get turned off by that message? Because, I mean, if you imagine if somebody from the future, I'm a sci-fi nerd, okay, but somebody like Back to the Future came from like 200 years ago, or 200 years in the future, came here and told us all that, oh, by the way, guys, the Earth is actually flat, but the way that we perceive it is as round, and there's this factor we have like completely not known until like 100 years ago, or in my time, so it actually is flat. We look at this guy and be like, what asylum did you come from? You know, right? Unless, of course, he could prove it to us, but that's a whole different, thing, right? It's the same thing. If you try to advance something to somebody in such a way where you obscure your message, the primary point, right? They're going to get turned off by that message. If the early Muslims believed, honestly, that the Quran was giving them new information about the physical world, not only what relevance would that be to their lives, but how would that have affected the way that they perceive things? And if it was giving them new information, they realized this, why did they not incorporate it into their own way of living, their own standards of technology and science? Why did they have to adopt extensively from the Greeks and the Persians? Prior to, that was prior. Of course, they eventually modified those things because the Arab civilization is, of course, very intelligent. Of course, they were actually great empiricists. That's why they were able to modify a lot of these texts later and to advance their own theories. But they needed a jumping off point. Why wasn't the jumping off point the Qur'an for science? Why? If that's the case. So, and to teach humanity about what to expect in the future, the unseen, and the nature of disbelief. So, I believe this will end my... Yes, I'm done. Yay. Okay. So, I think now that I've given you guys enough questions and challenges, and I think that now we can open up to further discussion. So, is that too more? No?
Now we can go till 7, and if it gets heated, we can...
I didn't even know how long it was. So, I have a watch, I don't know what it is. So, that's up to you guys. But please feel free to ask questions and challenge, etc. Yes, sir?
Yeah, I have one challenge. So, in the Quran, shouldn't it at least be consistent with reality if we don't have to have scientific claims? Shouldn't it at least be consistent with reality? For example, in Surah Al-Mulk, verse number 5, it says, وَلَقَدْ زَيَّنَّا السَّمَاءَ الدُّنْيَا بِمَصَابِيحَ وَجَعَلْنَاهَا رُجُومًا لِلشَّيَاطِينِ وَأَعْتَدْنَا لَهُمْ عَذَابَ السَّعِيرِ. And we have from the old...
Sent the comments to the stars to hit the devils.
Should I read it then for context?
No, I think everyone understands. You know the comets and the stars.
You don't know where.
Oh yeah, please. I'm sorry. My bad.
And we have from the old adorned the lowest heaven with lamps, and we have made such lamps as missiles to drive away the evil ones, and have prepared for them a penalty of blazing fire. So essentially, it's saying that stars are like missiles,
Okay.
and it's being thrown at devils.
Missiles. It's awesome.
Okay.
So, like, what is the objection?
So the objection is that shouldn't this verse be consistent with reality?
Okay. So, are you saying that jinn are part of reality?
Jinn are part of reality.
Okay. So, what does science have to do with that?
So it's making a claim that
It's claiming that the comets and the stars they hit the jinn that we can't see.
yeah, but then Islamophobes might say that this particular claim, it's the Prophet is confusing stars with meteors.
Well, that's nonsensical because so there's something that we didn't get into much discussion with the nature of not translation, but incommensurability. So Thomas Kuhn came up with this concept called that there was whenever a paradigm was changed, there was a problem with language because the terminology would be changed as well to incorporate all that new information. So, for example, if the Prophet was talking about stars in general, he's probably referring to all objects within a specific sphere. He's not, just because he doesn't have specific words. That's another problem with this whole issue, with this whole entire claim that scientific miracles, because we're using contemporary scientific language to describe what 1400 years ago somebody would have, how they would have described the world. That's nonsense. That's complete nonsense. Like I've seen even ex-Muslims and Islamophobes do this all the time. They're like, oh, because it doesn't mention this specific term from 21st century, therefore it's false. You know. Yes.
So what you're saying is that basically it's trying to figure out what is this question, because like like a lot of people like they try to point to stuff that's happening today to prove that the day of judgment is coming.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any objections to that as
Yes.
well?
Because we don't know. There are signs, but that doesn't mean we know exactly when it's going to happen. I know there are certain scholars out there who think that it's happening now, and like there are certain scholars out there who think that in 100 years it's going to happen, and I don't buy that at all. I think that's also very dangerous, because when you have that view of reality, then you act very differently. How do I put this? So, for example, with ISIS, if I bring them up again, but their whole assumption is that they're the final caliphate, basically, and that they're going to have the final battle of Jadid, and that the Romans, the West is going to come. They're going to have that huge battle. Of course, now they don't have the town anymore because they got overrun and taken back. But that whole philosophy drove them to such extreme measures because they really believed that it was going to happen like in their time. And of course, if it whenever that time comes, of course that'll be rational to do certain things, not what ISIS is doing, but to take certain measures. But to simply do it off assumptions of what you're reading, that's dangerous. It's very dangerous.
So is there like a distinguish between scientific miracles and then like prophetic miracles? Like when it says that Musa alayhi salam like split the Red Sea, are there scholars who historically interpreted that as more like a moral argument?
They would say that it was an exception to a general rule. Like a miracle is generally something that Allah allowed to happen. It's not something that we could scientifically verify.
So when you're using the term miracle, you're talking about like
no
contemporary.
Yeah, like anything that everything that we understand of science today can be found in the Qur'an.
Okay.
Which is, as far as I'm concerned, is nonsensical for like a number of reasons that I've already pointed out. But also, I want to reemphasize the fact that science is constantly changing. In 100 years, our understanding of these theories is going to change. So what? Muslims in the 100 years from now are going to be like, oh, it's in there too. At what point is it going to stop? At what point are we going to stop using science as a measuring tool for the revelation? That's dangerous. Extreme. And I've seen, and one thing we didn't mention either, was that a lot of people have come to Islam as a result of this da'wah. I'm not denying that, but a lot of Muslims have also left because of this da'wah. Most ex-Muslims that I find online are ex-Muslims because of this. That's their primary argument. I'm not saying, or maybe that's the way that they rationalize it. Maybe there's other reasons, of course, but that's their primary rationalization behind reading Islam, is because they read the Qur'an, they found all these scientific problems, and they left. And I think it's doing more damage than good. And even many people who used to advance the argument, like Hamza Swords, is completely, not completely, well, he's almost done a 180. Because he's seen the not only the difficulties in defending it, but also in the damage that's done to a lot of young Muslims. Yes. Wow, so many hands. Do you want to go? Okay. And then you had a lot of question time before. That's okay, so I'll come back to you, I promise, though.
She was first.
Who was first? Okay, sister. Yeah.
So I had a question about your inconsistencies page.
Mm-hmm.
I know you said that you should interpret all the scientific miracles in the same sense as in like one literally, one figuratively.
Mm-hmm.
But when we interpret the rest of the Quran, like any historical ayah or anything, we don't exactly do it consistently. Sometimes we say, yeah, this ayah is relative to the Prophet's time, and this one is more universal, or like ayahs about the battle, like battles in general, scholars tend to say like that was very relative to their time, and so we should look at it in that context. and other ayats we say, yeah, they're very universal, so this is what we should look at. So I don't understand why we can't look at scientific ayats in the same way, like, yes, this one's figurative, this is literal, and like, why can't we interpret ayahs in different ways?
Well,
like it doesn't need to be consistent throughout.
First, I would disagree with the sentiment that when you do it from like, when you examine like the historical context behind a particular ayah or the hukam behind a particular ruling and things like this is inconsistent. Because we're actually being very consistent by referring to the interpretations of the classical scholars and, you know, the interpretations of the companions and even the prophetic hadith, things like this. So we actually have a standard by which we can demarcate between what is figurative, what isn't, when is it applied then, when is it applied now. We have a whole scholarly tradition of fiqh, also with respect to law. I mean, so, whereas with the scientific miracles, there's nothing, literally nothing. Like there's nothing to refer to. You can't find anything. There's no evidence from any scholarly tradition, from any from any scholar or from even just like the different sects, even like the Shiite and the Sunni. Like you can't even find this. There are very few, like a minority views, and then when they're expressed, the majority of scholars come in and say like, no, that's wrong. Like Imam Shatibi did. He didn't even mention these people. That's how insignificant they were during his time. You know, usually when a scholar is trying to refute another scholar, he'll mention him by name, especially if it's like a big deal. Like if he's a big name, everyone knows who he is. He has to mention him to make sure that everyone understands where this is coming from and to give credit to the person, et cetera, et cetera. And then, you know, maybe he'll say something respectful about him. Imam Shatibi dedicated 2 pages to these unknown people, which makes you think that they're probably not even scholars. They were probably just some random guys like in the market talking, you know, and he heard it. And then he just wanted to make like a footnote. That's how insignificant the interpretation was in the past, to such an extent that they barely even talked about it. Only now are we seeing this. Only now in our time period are we seeing this. So yes, that would be mine. Who's next?
I'm just confused by how, so you were saying how we can't interpret some things according to our views today because they would make no sense to the people living there at the time. But then the Qur'an in that sense is written to be applicable to the people in those times, or is it written to be applicable to everyone? Like some of the miracles that they would have been like, wow, this is truly the strength of Allah in their time is different from what we would strengthen our iman with today.
Okay.
So how is it applicable to our time?
That's
then,
a good question.
times in the
The reason it's applicable to our time is because we have this reference, right? So we can also apply it to analogous situations in the future. So let me give you an example, sort of based on fiqh or sunnah. Okay. Did the Prophet, peace be upon him, ride on a camel?
Yeah.
Did he fight with a sword? More or less. Okay. Do we ride on camels and fight with swords today?
Not usually.
Okay. Now one. I want to know what parties you're going to. But why did he use those swords to fight?
Because that's what they
Why did he
use.
ride a camel?
So that's what people did.
To travel. Okay, so what do we have today? Cars. What do we have aside from swords? Well, we still have swords, but guns, right? So he had different materials, but similar applicability. Okay, and that way we make analogies. Right. We can also look at other ways to. The Qur'an was viewed as a linguistic miracle at its time. It still is, by the way. That hasn't changed. Okay. Even when you translate it, its coherency is very apparent. You know, if you read the Qur'an in English, even if you don't know Arabic, there's a level of coherency in that in the structure of the Qur'an that is amazing. Okay. The message itself, the moral message, the spiritual message behind it, the way that it rhymes in Arabic, the prose, it's gorgeous. Okay, it's unmatched. And you can still examine that even if if you don't understand classical Arabic. You can still examine that. You can still understand that to an extent. Oh, I'm 2 minutes, sorry. Likewise, there are other ways that we can strengthen our iman. There are other ways that we can understand the miraculous nature of the Qur'an. And we look at the companions and we look at the Prophet, peace be upon him. Let me ask you a question. This is something that I think many people don't really ask themselves sometimes. You're talking about an unlettered man, okay, who didn't read as much till later in his life, or write, who could, on the fly, it was revealed to him, but let's just assume that we're just looking at it from our apparent, perspective. On the fly, come up with a message that could challenge every single poet in his society without difficulty. Okay, that was completely and utterly coherent to the point where there was not even one contradiction. It was revealed over a course of how long? 22 years. What we're reading is one compilation. He memorized all of this without contradicting himself for over 20 years. How long does it take to recite the entire Qur'an? Probably, 2 days? If you did it all the way through, about 2 days. Can you not contradict yourself over a period of 2 days, reciting the same thoughts over and over again? No, it's probably going to last 5 minutes. I can't last 5 minutes. What about this? How did an unlettered merchant with no prior education, no prior military background, no prior learning in technology, science, etc., able to influence a bunch of desert nomads into conquering the 2 largest empires in the world at the time in less than a decade? Historians today are still trying to figure out how that happened. They still don't understand. They literally do not understand how this was possible. They keep saying, well, the Persians and the Byzantines were weak at the time, but you're talking about like an army of like 300 people sometimes fighting like an army of like 10,000 and winning. Like, this doesn't make any sense. If that's not miraculous to you, historically speaking, I don't know what to tell you. Because you will not find one historical figure in history that had that much success in that short amount of time with as little as they had. You're talking about camels and horses. They didn't even have proper gear on the horse. They had like rusted swords, and they went after the largest armies in the world. And they were able to conquer both of them with little effort. That is, I'm using a common term, insane. If you were to think about it, that's just literally insane from any normal human perspective. Okay, that sounds like a movie. Like, it just, I don't know how to explain that. And the Prophet's character, if you've studied the Seerah, how can you can't compare this man to anyone. He was so consistent in his behavior. It was amazing. And the companions were so open about it. They were so transparent about his life because of that consistency. They didn't even try to hide anything because they knew how amazing he was. Even in the way he treated his enemies, he was so nuanced. He was so balanced in many respects. So I would say that there's a lot more than just, I feel, and I'm not trying to insult anyone. I want to say this, that when I feel like people emphasize these scientific miracles so much as like the main thing to convince people, I feel like they're degrading the message. They're degrading the history. And not intentionally. I'm just saying that it's like there are so many better things to be talking about in Islam than whether there's science in the Qur'an. There are so many things in there that would convince a moral, sane human being to come to Islam than whether or not it talks about fresh and salt water or ants talking. I'm serious. Like, there is so much more in the Qur'an and from the Prophet's life that is more convincing. I didn't get I'm a revert to Islam. Okay, I did not get convinced because somebody told me that the Big Bang was in there. I honestly couldn't care. Okay, honestly. And I read that passage. I didn't think it was. I was like, oh, that's interesting, but it didn't. That's not what convinced me to come to Islam. What convinced me was reading the Prophet's life. What convinced me was reading the success of the early Muslim community. What convinced me was reading the message of the Qur'an itself, its moral and spiritual message, and how it affected my heart. That's what convinced me to come to Islam. And if you look at all the early scholars as well, those who converted to Islam as well, they won't tell you, oh, it's because of the facts that I found in there. It had nothing to do with it. That is not what compelled them to martyr themselves or to dedicate their lives towards preaching and towards teaching. People like Ibn Taymiyyah, okay, who never married, fought numerous jihad, wrote numerous books, did not stay convinced with Islam because of some sort of facts, or any of these scholars that you can think of. Okay? It all had to do with the moral and spiritual guidance, the spiritual lessons therein. It had to do with the coherency of the message and the simplicity of it, and how much it impacted them and influenced them towards greater things. We have 1,400 years of success. There are a lot of hiccups along the way, but we are literally the most powerful civilization to have ever existed on this planet because of that book, because of the Qur'an. And you're telling me you need scientific miracles? No offense, but that's nonsense. Only in the past 100 years have we been weakened to such an extent, and that's been our own fault. Okay, I'm done preaching. So what's next?
We break from Maghrib and then
Oh, Maghrib, yes.